welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
So today we're really getting into George Orwell's 1984, but maybe from a different angle.
Right. Instead of just rereading the book itself, we're looking at how people were talking about it around the actual year 1984.
Exactly. We've got this great collection of essays, symposia, all from the mid-'80s. It was clearly a moment when, well, everyone was thinking about Orwell.
Yeah, a real snapshot in time. We're mainly drawing from three key collections. There's John C. Broderick's George Orwell in 1984, Robert Mulvihill's Reflections on America in 1984, an Orwell Symposium, and also Patrick Reilly's book, George Orwell, The Age's Adversary.
And it's amazing the sheer amount of attention Orwell got then. Peter Stansky mentions that you had conferences everywhere. Antwerp, Strasbourg, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress.
It really felt like people needed to figure out what his book meant now that the actual year was, happening.
Yeah, like, were the warnings accurate? What did it all mean for them?
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, is to explore those mid-'80s thoughts and see why Orwell, and especially 1984, still has such a grip on us.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with Orwell himself. Alfred Kazin's essay, Not One of Us. That title comes from a great anecdote.
Oh, right. The British Labour Party secretary during the war kind of dismissing him.
Yeah. It just instantly shows you how independent Orwell was.
Yeah.
A real outsider, maybe.
Well, Kazim makes that point very strongly. He wasn't afraid to criticize, well, pretty much everyone.
He lists them, doesn't he?
Yeah, intellectuals on the left, the ex-left, the would-be left, and the ideological right. He pulled no punches.
Which, as that labor guy showed, didn't always make him popular.
Definitely not. Kazim links this back to his background, too, which is kind of, well, full of contrasts.
Eden educated, served in the Imperial Police in Burma.
Right. But then you have this deep sympathy for ordinary people fighting in Spain, his writing.
It's a strange mix, but it clearly shaped his viewpoint.
And Kazim puts him in a specific tradition. He calls him a pamphleteer.
Like Swift or Paine.
Exactly. Someone using writing for direct, forceful social and political commentary. And Cousin argues Orwell was the best of them in the first half of the 20th century, using words as a weapon, really.
Okay, so turning to the novel itself, 1984. Dennis Donahue talks about influences. He brings up Zamyatin's We.
Right. The Russian dystopian novel that came before Orwell's. Donahue sees it as pretty crucial.
How so?
He thinks it showed Orwell a way forward after Animal Farm, maybe gave him some ideas for plot, characters, even though Donahue admits it doesn't quite feel as, well, monumental to us now.
Interesting. So maybe not as famous, but a key step for Orwell.
That's Donahue's argument, but he also points to more, immediate English influences.
Like what?
Things like the wartime Ministry of Information, the BBC, the post-war Attlee government, just the general feel of life in Britain then.
So real-world details grounding the fiction.
Exactly. He blended these different strands, the literary influence from Zamyatin and the very concrete reality of Britain.
And there was another influence mentioned, Burnham.
Yes, James Burnham. Donahue credits him with the idea of the oligarchy, the ruling class, and those three superstates always at war.
Which is different from Zamyatin's single-state idea, right?
Very different. It shows Orwell wasn't just copying. He was taking ideas, transforming them, building something new, and frankly, more complex in its structure.
Okay, so influences are one thing. But Jeffrey Myers takes a different tack. He argues 1984 isn't really prophecy.
Right. He sees it much more as a reflection of the 1930s.
That specific decade.
Yeah, he lists it all out. The Depression, wars, fascism, Nazism, the famine in Ukraine, Trotsky's murder, the Soviet purges. It's a horrifying catalog, really.
So the seeds of the book were sown much earlier than when he actually wrote it.
That's a Myers point. He contrasts the 30s with 1948, when Orwell finished the book. Things were still grim then, of course, Soviet control in Eastern Europe, the Berlin airlift.
But the core ideas, Myers says, came from that earlier, incredibly turbulent decade.
It's less about predicting the future, more about reacting to the totalitarianism he'd already seen emerge.
And Myers brings up Orwell's personal experience, too, particularly Spain.
Yes, that's crucial. Orwell wasn't just reporting. He was there. He fought. He was wounded.
Unlike many other writers who went to Spain.
Right. That first-hand experience, Myers argues, gave his writing a kind of raw credibility, an authenticity you couldn't fake.
It wasn't just theory for him.
Absolutely not. It was lived, and you feel that in the writing.
Thinking about what drove him, Jenna Calder looks at that line from Why I Write.
Oh, the horrible, exhausting struggle, quote, driven by a demon.
Yeah, that one. It suggests writing wasn't just a job for him, was it?
Calder thinks it was almost all-consuming, that this demon meant you couldn't easily separate Orwell the writer from Eric Blair the man.
Like writing was just fundamental to who he was.
A relentless need to pursue and express truth, as he saw it.
Let's talk about his style. Hugh Kenner has this fascinating take on the plain style.
Right, he calls it a counterfeit of natural utterance, which sounds odd at first.
It does. What does he mean?
Kenner argues Orwell deliberately crafted this straightforward style to fight against the political jargon of the time, what Orwell himself called newspeak.
Especially the language used on the left?
Yes, that abstract, sometimes deliberately obscure language. Kenner says Orwell was studiously concrete.
He gives that example from The Lion and the Unicorn, doesn't he?
As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me. Bang! Instantly grounds you.
So the plain style wasn't just simple writing. It was a political act itself.
A pushback against obfuscation, yeah.
Now, Bernard Crick adds another layer. He asks if we can read 1984 as satire.
Which seems counterintuitive, maybe, given how bleak it is.
Right. But Crick points to things like Parsons being denounced by his own daughter. Is there something grimly comic there?
Or even Winston's final tears, that maybe there's a kind of comic distancing, as Crick puts it.
It's a challenging idea.
Yeah. It really is. It pushes you to think about satire differently. Maybe it doesn't have to be laugh-out-loud funny. Perhaps it's about highlighting absurdity, even horrifying absurdity.
Then you have Mark Crispin Miller and Sheldon Wolin. They take a much broader view.
Looking at the Enlightenment, right?
Exactly. Seeing 1984 as a kind of commentary on where the Enlightenment's focus on science and technology ended up.
The argument being that the drive for a predictable, useful world ironically led to, well, horrors.
Total propaganda, death camps, and atom bombs, as they put it.
And Miller makes that connection to Horkheimer and Adorno.
Working in L.A. around the same time Orwell was planning the book.
Yeah, grappling with very similar ideas about progress having a dark side. It suggests this was a concern bubbling up in different places.
Okay, let's bring in Patrick Reilly's book, George Orwell, The Age's Adversary. He paints Orwell almost as a hero figure.
A writer is hero, yeah. Emphasizing his moral courage, his willingness to speak unfashionable, unwelcome truth.
But Reilly also calls him a supreme political writer, the best since Swift.
Right, and a brilliant essayist and journalist, too. It's not either for Reilly.
So the moral strength and the writing skill are intertwined.
Completely. The morality fuels the politics, and the writing skill gives it power and reach. They work together.
Reilly makes a lot of comparisons with Swift.
He does. He sees a similar anger at tyrants, but also, interestingly, a similar frustration with the victims sometimes.
He finds Swiftian echoes in Orwell's prose, too, right? Those vivid, sometimes nasty images.
Yes, like that ravine of tall, leprous houses line. It's powerful, unsettling imagery, very Swiftian.
And this ties into Orwell's view of the working class, which Reilly sees as complex.
Mm-hmm. Genuine admiration for the people.
But disgust at their living conditions.
Exactly. And Reilly even suggests Orwell disliked things like modern public housing, not because it wasn't clean, but because he felt it destroyed traditional community.
Almost hinting at something like Bentham's panopticon, that idea of control through design.
It's a subtle suggestion, but it fits with Orwell's deep suspicion of top-down control, even well-intentioned control.
Reilly also touches on religion. Orwell was pretty critical of organized religion.
Called it a swindle, yeah. Not a fan of clergymen.
But Reilly argues that even his secular writing wrestles with religious questions.
Absolutely. He points to Orwell's statement from 1944 about needing to restore a sense of absolute right and wrong, especially since belief in immortality was declining.
So even without traditional faith, that need for a moral anchor was crucial for Orwell.
Reilly sees that as proof of Orwell's honesty, his grappling with the big questions, even outside formal religion.
What about Animal Farm? Reilly has an interesting take there, too.
He argues it's not just anti-Soviet,
Ian.
meaning it's also critical of capitalism. Orwell wasn't trying to tear down one system just to boost the other. It's a broader critique of power structures.
And he knows it's pessimistic, like 1984.
Very much so. But the beast fable form, Reilly suggests, kind of contains the bleakness, allows for some dark humor.
He compares the humor to those Donald McGill postcards.
Yeah, that sort of low-course comedy, not necessarily a direct satire of Stalin himself, but drawing on this other, quite British comedic tradition.
Which brings us back to how 1984 is often read, or maybe misread.
Ah, the prophecy issue again. Reilly really pushes back against that.
He quotes E.M. Forster from 1950.
About the monsters of the apocalypse existing in embryo today. Yeah.
And Reilly basically says, look, the horrors aren't some future fantasy. They are already upon us.
It's a very forceful statement. He's saying, don't dismiss this as fiction. See the parallels now.
He worries future generations might just see it as hysteria if they live in easier times.
A neurotic panic monger. Yeah, he fears the book's warnings could be lost if people aren't vigilant. It really shows the urgency felt in the 80s.
Finally, Peter Stansky reflects on all this intense focus on Orwell around 1984.
He calls it an extravagance of criticism.
And he worries it might lead to the opposite later on, like people getting tired of Orwell.
Exactly, a reaction of indifference. So he suggests maybe it's time to, broaden the focus.
Look beyond just 1984.
Right. Explore his other novels, his reportage, the essays, the journalism, his letters. There's so much more there.
It's a good point. Don't let the giant shadow of one book obscure the rest.
Absolutely. There's a whole landscape of Orwell's thought.
So, wrapping up this look back at the mid-'80s reflections, what are the big takeaways?
Well, definitely Orwell's fierce independence, his critical stance towards everyone.
And how 1984 wasn't just plucked from thin air, but deeply rooted in history and various influences.
Yeah, and that constant tension. Is it prophecy? Is it history? Is it satire? The debate clearly hasn't stopped.
His style, his moral core.
Yeah.
It all feeds into why he still resonates.
Definitely. Which leaves a question, maybe, for you listening, thinking about our time right now. Which parts of Orwell's critique feel sharpest, feel most relevant?
And the other side of that coin. Have we focused so much on 1984 that we're maybe missing other crucial things he had to say?
Are we engaging with the whole thinker or just, using the most famous novel as a kind of shorthand warning?
It's a lot to think about. Definitely worth pondering.